Okay, so today we're diving into DeFi.
Decentralized finance.
Really exciting stuff.
It is exciting. Imagine you want to earn interest on your crypto.
Or maybe you need to borrow some.
Okay.
But there are no banks involved.
Yeah.
That's the revolution that DeFi promised.
Right.
And today we're going deep into one of the platforms that made it all possible, the Compound Protocol.
Yeah, Compound was one of the first DeFi platforms out there.
And it's fascinating that it's still going strong today.
It really is.
So we're going to unpack their original white paper from February 2019.
Okay.
Don't worry, we're not going to get bogged down in technical jargon.
We're here to extract those golden nuggets of insight.
Absolutely.
So to set the stage, let's go back to 2019.
What was the problem Compound was trying to solve?
Yeah.
What was happening in the crypto world back then?
I mean, Bitcoin was starting to make waves.
But a lot of people, I think, still saw crypto as this niche thing.
Right.
But even for those who believed in its potential,
Yeah.
there was a huge problem.
If you held crypto.
There weren't many good options for borrowing against it or lending it out to earn interest.
So it kind of felt like having a bunch of money, but no way to make it grow.
And even worse, as I understand it, just holding onto your crypto could cost you money back then.
Absolutely. You actually had negative yield, things like storage costs and risks,
Wow.
especially if you weren't comfortable keeping it on an exchange ate into your holdings.
It was a real barrier to crypto's growth.
Wow. So in the early days, holding crypto was actually costing people money.
Yeah.
That's wild.
And I know there were centralized exchanges starting to offer things like borrowing and lending, but weren't there still some big question marks surrounding those options as well?
Yes, definitely.
Centralized exchanges were vulnerable to hacks.
Uh-huh.
They often lacked transparency,
Right.
and they only supported a limited number of assets.
It wasn't the most user-friendly environment, especially for newcomers.
So it sounds like for people who believed in the promise of crypto,
This was incredibly frustrating.
like trying to drive a car with a flat tire,
Right.
it was in this environment that Compound entered the scene.
Proposing a solution that at the time seemed pretty radical.
Building a financial system on the blockchain.
Wow.
They called them money markets on the blockchain?
Yeah.
What exactly did that look like?
Essentially, Compound wanted to replicate the money markets that existed in traditional finance.
But do it on the blockchain. They recognized that if crypto was going to reach its full potential,
It needed the same kind of financial infrastructure.
the same tools as traditional markets.
So how did they propose to actually do that?
Because that's a pretty big goal, right?
Yeah.
Creating an entirely new financial system.
It is, but at its core, the concept is fairly simple.
Instead of going through a traditional intermediary like a bank,
Okay.
Compound allows anyone to become a lender or a borrower in a decentralized way,
So you're interacting directly with the protocol.
which is governed by code, not by any single entity.
Okay, so cutting out the middleman,
The banks.
the institutions, and putting the power directly in the hands of the users.
Right.
That's a pretty powerful concept in itself.
That is huge.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Okay, so no more banks, no more centralized control.
But what about something as fundamental as interest rates?
How are those determined in this new system?
That's where things get really interesting.
Compound uses what are called algorithmic interest rates.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about the problems of fixed interest rates?
And the limitations of centralized exchanges?
Right.
Compound essentially throws those out the window.
Algorithmic interest rates. So instead of a person or a board deciding...
It's all determined by kind.
Exactly.
That sounds pretty futuristic.
How does that actually work?
It all comes down to supply and demand
Okay.
for a particular crypto asset.
Okay.
Think of it like a traditional marketplace. But instead of apples and oranges, we're talking about Ether, stable coins like Day. Those are cryptocurrencies designed to maintain a stable value, often pegged to the US dollar.
And other crypto assets.
Got it.
So the more people want to borrow, let's say, Ether.
The higher the interest rate climbs for lenders.
Right.
Makes sense.
And if there's a ton of Ether available, but not a lot of demand, the interest rates would drop.
You got it.
It's all about finding that equilibrium point.
Where borrowers and lenders meet.
It's an incredibly elegant solution.
Okay, this is starting to paint a clearer picture for me.
So let's say I want to become a lender on Compound.
What does that process look like?
Okay.
What do I actually do with my crypto?
Well, you deposit your crypto into the Compound protocol.
Specifically into the market for that asset.
Okay.
But here's where it gets a little different from traditional lending. You're not directly lending out your crypto.
Okay, now you're just messing with me.
I thought this was all about lending.
And here I am, ready to lend out my crypto.
And you're telling me it's not that simple.
It is. But instead of lending it directly,
You're essentially supplying it to a pool,
okay,
a money market for that specific asset.
in return for depositing your crypto compound gives you something called AIC
What
tokens.
tokens? Is that kind of like a receipt for my crypto?
That's a great way to think about it.
These AIC tokens represent your portion of the assets in that particular money market.
Okay.
And here's the exciting part. As that money market accrues interest from borrowers,
The value of your AIC tokens increases.
so they're essentially growing while you hold them.
Okay, now that's what I'm talking about.
Now we're getting to the good stuff, making that money work for me.
But if it's not interest being paid directly,
How does my stake actually increase in value?
it's called implicit interest.
Okay.
And it's a key concept in how compound works.
You're not getting paid interest in the traditional sense.
Right.
Instead, the value of your stake in the market
Represented by those SAF tokens.
grows over time.
Interesting.
So how does compound connect all these pieces?
You've got this supply and demand dynamic driving interest rates.
You've got these stair tokens representing people's stake in the market.
Right.
How does it all come together to ensure that everyone's actually earning those returns?
That's where the utilization rate comes in.
Okay.
This is one of the most important factors to understand.
When it comes to compound and how it works,
Okay, utilization rate.
lay it on me.
What is that?
It's essentially a measure of how much of the available asset in a given market is actually being borrowed.
Okay.
It's the ratio of borrowed assets to the total supply.
So if a lot of people are borrowing, the utilization rate is high.
High utilization rate, which
Yeah.
means higher interest rates for lenders, right?
Exactly. The protocol automatically adjusts those interest rates based on how much of a given asset is being borrowed,
High demand leads to a high utilization rate.
which translates into better returns for those who are lending their crypto.
It's like a self-regulating financial system.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've talked about what it looks like to be a lender on Compound.
What about borrowing? What's that experience like?
Sure. Let's say you want to borrow some Ether using Compound.
The first thing you need to do is supply collateral.
Okay.
And this is where those tokens we talked about earlier come back into play.
They can actually be used as collateral.
So it's like I'm putting up my SIG tokens as a kind of guarantee.
Like, hey, Compound, I'm good for this loan. Just look at my trick tokens.
Exactly. You're essentially locking up your crypto assets to secure the loan.
Now, just like in traditional lending,
Right.
you can't borrow the full value of your collateral.
Okay.
The amount you can borrow depends on the asset you're using as collateral.
Right. So some assets are seen as riskier than others.
But how does Compound actually determine how much I can borrow against a specific asset?
That's where the collateral factor comes in.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Stable coins, because they're pegged to something like the US dollar, are considered less risky than...
Say a more volatile cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
So they might have a higher collateral factor, maybe 75%.
That means you could potentially borrow up to 75% of the value of your stablecoin holdings,
Okay, so higher collateral factor, lower risk.
which means you can borrow more.
Right.
That makes sense. But what happens if, for whatever reason, the value of my collateral suddenly drops?
That's where things can get a little tricky.
And it highlights the risk borrowers need to be aware of when using a platform like Compound.
If the value of your collateral drops below a certain threshold, you risk liquidation.
Liquidation. That doesn't sound good.
It's not ideal.
But it's a critical mechanism that allows Compound.
And really any DeFi protocol to protect itself from losses.
Okay.
Essentially, if the value of your collateral falls too low,
Other users on the platform can buy up a portion of your debt at a discount.
they make a profit, and more importantly, the system remains stable.
So it's kind of like a safety valve for the entire ecosystem.
Right.
Risky for the borrower.
But necessary for the overall health of the platform. It's really fascinating stuff. We've talked a lot about slick tokens.
They seem pretty important in all this.
Is there anything else people should know about them beyond using them as collateral?
Yes, definitely.
Lick tokens actually give you a voice in the future of the Compound protocol.
Okay.
This is DeFi. It's all about decentralization.
Right.
And that decentralization extends to how the protocol itself is governed.
Okay, so no big banks calling the shots.
It's the users who have a say in how things are run.
Exactly. As a Slicks token holder,
You have voting rights.
you can participate in governance by proposing and voting on changes to how the protocol operates.
Wow.
That could mean adding support for new cryptocurrencies,
Adjusting the interest rate models.
really anything that impacts how Compound functions.
Wow, so you're not just earning interest or taking out loans.
You're actively participating in shaping the direction of an entire financial platform.
That's light years ahead of anything we've seen in traditional finance.
It really is groundbreaking.
And that's the beauty of what Compound created.
They took these established financial concepts
Money markets, lending, borrowing.
and reimagined them for a decentralized world.
They essentially created a blueprint for the entire DeFi movement we're seeing today.
It makes you wonder what other aspects of our financial system could be reinvented, reimagined in this decentralized way.
What's next for DeFi?
Right.
I guess that's a question for our next deep dive.
Indeed.
For listeners who want to explore the Compound protocol for themselves.
Check out the link in the show notes.
It's a fascinating world to explore.
You might even find yourself on the cutting edge of a financial revolution.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of DeFi.
Until next time.